October 22, 2015, American Delta Force operators and Kurdish Peshmerga fighters launched a desperate mission to save dozens of people who had less than 24 hours to live. Trapped inside an extremist prison compound in Hawija, Iraq, these 70 Iraqi soldiers and civilians weren't just nameless prisoners. They were sons, fathers, and brothers. Innocent men about to die for nothing more than opposing a brutal regime. Intelligence indicated the militants were already digging graves outside the walls. Time was running out fast. Among the rescue team sent to save them was Master Sergeant Joshua Wheeler, a seasoned warrior who had spent years fighting bad guys all over the world. He knew the risks, but when the moment came, he didn't hesitate. As gunfire erupted and the mission seemed all but lost, Wheeler led his men forward into the heart of danger. But despite making the ultimate sacrifice, another one of his comrades did not let his death be in vain. In a moment ripped straight out of a Hollywood movie, a fellow Delta operator quite literally tackled a burning building all by himself in a feat that America would recognize as worthy of its highest award for valor, the Medal of Honor. By October 2015, the extremist group was on the defensive. The tide had begun to turn after their lightning-fast conquest of territory across Iraq and Syria in 2014. A coordinated campaign of airstrikes and ground operations by a coalition of over 60 nations had pushed them back in key areas. Despite these setbacks, the militants were still brutalizing millions under their control. Their domain included a vast swath of territory in the Hawija district of Kirkuk province, about 150 miles north of Baghdad. The predominantly Sunni area had fallen to them in June 2014, and the group's black flag now flew over government buildings, schools, and military outposts. But they weren't content simply controlling territory. Their brutality, especially against those they deemed enemies, knew no bounds. In a fit of rage against the collapsing military situation, in October 2015, fighters rounded up dozens of Iraqi civilians, many of them former members of Iraqi security forces and their family members. The fighters transported their captives to a prison compound in Hawija, where they faced a bleak future. The compound consisted of several buildings surrounded by walls and guard posts. It was located in the heart of militant-controlled territory, making any rescue attempt extremely risky. And it only got worse. An enemy defector gave American intelligence some disturbing information. Within 24 hours, the group was planning to execute all of the prisoners the next morning at dawn. The plan was to dig a burial site, force the prisoners to kneel along its edge, and systematically eliminate them all, while filming the entire atrocity. The clock was ticking and the lives of dozens hung in the balance. When intelligence about the planned executions reached US and Kurdish commanders, they knew there was no time to waste. Kurdish intelligence had identified the prison compound through sources on the ground, and US surveillance drones confirmed the presence of enemy fighters guarding what appeared to be a detention facility. Although the exact number of prisoners remained unclear, the intelligence was deemed credible enough to warrant immediate action. The mission was assigned to a joint task force of Americans and Kurds. From the American side, operators from the Army's elite Delta Force would participate. These men, officially known as the 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta, represented America's premier unit. Among them was Master Sergeant Joshua Wheeler, a highly decorated operator with 14 deployments under his belt, and Sergeant Major Thomas Patrick Payne, another veteran operator who had already earned a Purple Heart in Afghanistan. From the Kurdish side, a team of Peshmerga special operators would join the mission. The Peshmerga, whose name literally means those who face death, had been battling the group for years and were hardened veterans. Adding to these men's grit and determination was the personal loss of many friends and family members to the group, whom they were more than eager to avenge. They also knew the terrain well and had extensive regional intelligence networks. Without their assistance, the mission had zero chance of success. According to the original plan, the American operators would provide support, advise, and provide intelligence for the Kurdish forces who would lead the actual assault. The Americans would remain in a supporting role, consistent with President Obama's policy of no boots on the ground in the fight against the group. The assault element would consist of 70 operators, with the Americans providing helicopter transport, surveillance, and close air support, along with the Delta operators in the background, providing assistance as needed. However, as any good military person knows, even a good plan rarely survives first contact with the enemy. The plan was fraught with challenges from the start. The prison compound was deep in enemy territory, surrounded by enemy fighters and sympathizers, and the exact layout was unknown. A ground assault would be detected miles before reaching the target, so helicopters would be the only viable insertion method. But even from the air, the approach would be dangerous. Enemy fighters captured anti-aircraft weapons from the Iraqi army and set up defensive positions throughout Hawija. Along with their army of spotters and scouts, this would mean even a heliborne insertion risked detection. This would spell doom for the hostages before the helicopters even touched down. Furthermore, the mission faced severe time constraints. Intelligence indicated the executions would take place the following morning, leaving just hours to plan and execute the rescue. Planners worked throughout the night, analyzing satellite imagery, drone feeds, and intelligence reports to develop an assault plan. They identified multiple buildings within the compound that could house prisoners, with one larger building designated as the primary target. The mission would be launched under the cover of darkness, with the force infiltrating the area by helicopter. After securing a landing zone, the assault teams would breach the compound, neutralize the guards, and free the hostages. With the prisoners secured, the force would evacuate by helicopter before enemy fighters could mount a counterattack. But all of this was much easier said than done. What happened next? We can't show it all here without YouTube slapping this video with a warning, but we can show you on Patreon. To watch the full-length video completely uncensored, subscribe to my Patreon page, where there are no restrictions on what we can tell and show you there. Scan the code or use the link in the description now to watch the full video. Just after midnight, American Delta Force operators and Kurdish Peshmerga fighters boarded Chinooks and Blackhawks at a forward base in northern Iraq. The flight into the target area was quiet. Radio silence was strict. No chatter, no slip-ups. Inside the helicopters, Delta operators went over last-minute details again with their Kurdish counterparts. But soon, even these conversations ceased as they neared the landing zone outside Hawija. Hovering just over the treetops, the pilots came in low and fast. Surprise was everything. If the enemy picked up on the approach, the hostages could be executed before the skids even hit the dirt. But as the helos descended, the men on board didn't see anything abnormal. It was go time. The birds landed in a field just outside the compound. Within seconds, everyone was out so as not to get caught in a fatal funnel leaving a helo. After a quick head count, the force moved forward in a loose line abreast. Intelligence had estimated a dozen enemy guards, but as the teams pushed toward the compound, they spotted more fighters than expected. Armed patrols moving along the perimeter, flashlights cutting through the dark. The Peshmerga took point as planned, with Delta in overwatch. Then everything went to hell. Automatic fire erupted from multiple angles inside the compound. The Kurds took cover, pinned down and unable to do anything except put a few potshots over their heads. The element of surprise was gone, and with it, any reasonable hope there'll soon be any hostages left to rescue. That's when Master Sergeant Joshua Wheeler made the call. "On me!" he shouted as he completely threw the plan out the window. Not wanting to be outdone by a foreigner on their own land, the Kurds leapt up and followed behind Wheeler, firing blindly just to keep the enemy's heads down long enough so they didn't get theirs taken off. Despite the increasing fire, they advanced. Their push broke the enemy's momentum, and soon they had regained fire superiority over the enemy, who were now hiding for cover. This momentary lull in the firing allowed the Kurds to regroup and make it to the outer wall. Once at the compound wall, they faced another problem. The front gate was likely rigged to blow, so they had to make their own way in. Delta operators set charges and blew entry points through the outer wall, while the Kurds bum-rushed the first compound they found. Within seconds, the first Kurds had jumped through the door and began immediately clearing rooms one by one. Close quarters fight broke out, where seconds and fractions of an inch made the difference between life and death. Despite this, the superior training and firepower, the Kurds had soon beat back the militants who were more accustomed to collecting ransoms than fighting a real enemy. As the Kurds were clearing the compound, Wheeler's team reached an adjoining structure. As they moved to breach the door, gunfire erupted from a nearby position, and an enemy fighter got a lucky shot off. Although Wheeler returned fire, he ultimately caught 3 rounds as his team placed breaching charges on the outer door. His teammates worked to stabilize him, but the wound was fatal. Wheeler died on the battlefield, his 14th deployment, his final mission. But despite his loss, they still had a job to finish. With the Kurds busy clearing the first building, Sergeant Major Patrick Payne led another team inside the second building. From inside, they heard voices in frantic Arabic. They could be hostages, but they could also be an enemy fighter trying to lure them into a trap. But they had to take that chance. With Delta operators engaging fighters from other compounds, the team began clearing the second building. Inside, dozens of men, bound, blindfolded, terrified, waited in silence, thinking their time had run out. The operators cut restraints and began moving them towards the door. But due to their captivity, many of the men could hardly stand up, and operators had to basically manhandle prisoners out themselves. As this was going on, word arrived of more hostages at another structure deeper in the compound. But there was a problem. It was already on fire. ISIS fighters had torched it during the assault. Smoke poured from the building. Heat made the metal doors nearly impossible to handle. But leaving them wasn't an option. Payne led a small entry team to the building. Using bolt cutters, they broke the lock after numerous tries due to how hot the door was. And of course, as they tried to kick the door open, it was jammed. In a scene literally ripped out of a Hollywood war movie, Payne gripped the red-hot door with his bare hands and pulled with everything he had. Despite suffering severe burns on his hands, he finally flung the door open, but he wasn't ready for what he saw inside. Inside, more prisoners, disoriented, choking on smoke, were huddled in corners and wouldn't budge since they were all paralyzed with fear. He went in again and again, dragging men out as the flames spread. Each trip in meant greater risk, but he kept going until every hostage was out. After this literal Rambo scene, the compound was now secure. But while the main body of the enemy was now crumpled on the ground or fleeing for their own lives, the team still faced probing attacks all around the compound from fighters. This meant that despite freeing all the men, an extraction under fire with over 70 freed hostages, some injured, some barely able to move, meant the mission was still hanging by a thread. The Delta operators soon set up a casualty collection point. Medics treated the wounded and tried to patch them up good enough so they could hobble the half-mile to the extraction point. All while this was going on, the teams faced an increasing volume of fire as enemy fighters flirted with the idea of attacking, but stayed close to cover when American return fire got a little too close for comfort. This song and dance continued for hours. This happened numerous times, until just as the sun crested the horizon, the last helicopter lifted off from Hawija, stuffed with hostages. Although every hostage had been saved, the team had lost one of their best, but the mission was complete. 70 lives, over 20 of them Iraqi security forces taken in the enemy's blitz the year before, had literally stared Grim Reaper in the face, and death had blinked first. The Hawija raid echoed through both American and Iraqi societies. In America, the news of Master Sergeant Joshua Wheeler's death hit hard. He was a veteran of 14 deployments, with multiple tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. The 39-year-old operator from Roland, Oklahoma, left behind a wife and 4 children. His sacrifice marked a somber milestone, the first American combat death in the war against the militant group in Iraq. For the families of the freed hostages, the raid was nothing short of miraculous. Many had already begun mourning their loved ones, certain they would be executed. Instead, sons, fathers, and brothers returned home alive. The enemy's aura of invincibility was shattered, showing that even in their strongholds, they weren't beyond the reach of American and Kurdish forces. For Sergeant Major Thomas Patrick Payne, the mission would lead to the highest recognition of military valor. 5 years later, on September 11, 2020, President Donald Trump presented him with the Medal of Honor for his actions during the Hawija raid. The citation highlighted how Payne repeatedly entered a burning building under enemy fire to save hostages, refusing to leave until everyone was accounted for. Bye for now.